Every hair follicle on your body has a tiny smooth muscle attached to it, a band of fibers approximately 1 to 2 millimeters long, connecting the base of the hair to the surrounding skin. When this muscle contracts, it pulls the hair upright and compresses the skin around the follicle into a small raised bump. You have approximately 5 million of these muscles. You cannot control any of them. You cannot make them fire by willing it. You cannot stop them when they fire on their own. They are wired into the branch of your nervous system that controls your pupils, your sweat glands, and your heart rate, the involuntary branch, the one that operates without asking permission. In furred mammals, the contraction raises the fur coat. A cat that is cold erects its fur, trapping a layer of still air between the fur and the skin, an insulating blanket created by muscle contraction. A cat that is threatened erects its fur, making the animal appear larger, a visual display that says the body is bigger than it is. The insulating function and the threat display both depend on the fur being long enough and dense enough to produce a visible, functional change when raised. You lost the fur. The muscles remained. They still fire in cold, in fear, during powerful music, during a moment of awe that stops your breathing for a second. Your skin is attempting to raise a coat you no longer own, using muscles you cannot control, in response to signals that served a purpose 2 million years ago. The reflex is obsolete. The body kept it anyway, and the reason the body kept it reveals something about your nervous system that the reflex itself conceals. But before the reason, the 3 triggers. Because goosebumps are not one reflex. They are 3 separate reflexes that converge on 5 million identical muscles through 3 completely different pathways in your brain. The cold pathway, the fear pathway, the music pathway. Each starts in a different region of your nervous system. Each arrives at one destination, the tiny muscle pulling the hair upright. And the fact that 3 unrelated signals all produce one identical visible output is what makes goosebumps the most revealing involuntary response your body produces. When ambient temperature drops, cold-sensitive receptors in your skin activate and send signals through the spinal cord to your hypothalamus, the region of your brain that regulates body temperature. Your hypothalamus initiates a thermoregulatory response. Blood vessels in your skin constrict to reduce heat loss. Your muscles begin the rapid microcontractions you experience as shivering to generate metabolic heat, and the tiny muscles at each hair follicle contract to raise the body hair. In a furred ancestor, that contraction trapped the insulating air layer. In you, the hair is too short and too fine to trap anything. The contraction fires anyway because the pathway that triggers it has not been removed. Evolution does not remove unused reflexes unless they impose a survival cost. The hair-raising contraction costs almost no energy. It provides almost no benefit. There is no selection pressure to delete it. So it persists, a thermoregulatory ghost, firing every time you feel cold, attempting to insulate a body that cannot be insulated by hair it no longer has. The goosebumps on your arms in a cold room are a 2-million-year-old insulation program running on hardware that lost its insulating surface. Cold pathway has a linguistic fossil of its own. The phrase cold turkey, meaning abrupt withdrawal from an addictive substance, comes from goosebumps. During opioid withdrawal, the sympathetic nervous system rebounds violently from the suppression the drug imposed. The rebound produces intense, sustained piloerection across the entire body, arms, legs, torso. The skin covered in raised bumps that give it the appearance and texture of a plucked turkey. The bumps persist for hours or days because the sympathetic rebound is sustained rather than momentary. The phrase entered common language because the visible skin response was so dramatic and so consistent across withdrawal patients that it became the defining image of the process. Cold turkey is a description of goosebumps that will not stop. Duration of goosebumps varies by trigger and reveals which pathway produced them. Cold-triggered goosebumps persist for as long as the cold stimulus is present. Remove the cold, and the bumps resolve within seconds as the sympathetic drive subsides. Fear-triggered goosebumps persist for the duration of the threat and resolve as the threat detection system deactivates, typically 30 to 90 seconds after the stimulus ends. Music-triggered goosebumps are the briefest, a wave that rises and passes in 3 to 10 seconds, tracking the prediction error that produced it. The chord changes. The bumps appear. The prediction resolves. The bumps subside. The brevity of musical goosebumps reflects the brevity of the dopamine pulse, a momentary surge tied to a specific prediction error rather than a sustained state like cold or fear. Wave pattern is itself informative. Goosebumps do not appear uniformly across your body. They follow the segmental strips of skin that correspond to individual spinal nerves. The bumps typically begin on the forearms and spread to the upper arms, then the back of the neck, then down the spine and across the thighs. The wave reflects the sequential activation of sympathetic nerve clusters along the spinal column, each segment firing its hair-raising muscles in a cascade that travels outward from the point of strongest sympathetic innervation. You can watch the wave travel across your own arm in real time during a strong musical chill, the bumps appearing at the wrist, propagating toward the shoulder over 2 to 3 seconds. The speed of the wave is the speed of the sympathetic cascade propagating along the spinal chain. Goosebumps from music run through a completely different pathway from cold goosebumps, and the difference reveals something about your reward system that no other visible reflex can demonstrate. A finding published in Nature Neuroscience by Salimpour and colleagues measured what happens in the brain during the specific moments of music that produce chills and goosebumps. The peak emotional moments, the chord change you did not predict, the voice that enters unexpectedly, the quiet passage that suddenly swells correspond to dopamine release in your brain's reward circuitry. The same dopamine pathway that activates during food, during sex, during the anticipation of any reward the brain has learned to predict. The goosebumps during music are not a temperature response. They are a reward response, your brain's pleasure system firing, and the signal cascading down through the sympathetic nervous system to 5 million muscles that cold activates through a completely different route. Endpoint is identical. Trigger is unrelated. Cold goosebumps start in the skin. Music goosebumps start in the reward circuitry of the brain. Both arrive at identical muscles. Both produce identical bumps. The visible result is indistinguishable, but the internal origin is as different as shivering and laughing. When goosebumps appear on your arm during a piece of music, you are watching your reward system produce a visible motor output on the surface of your skin. No blood test required. No brain scan. The dopamine surge that the music triggered is producing a measurable, visible, real-time display on your forearm. Your skin is reporting your brain's reward activity through a reflex that was never designed for this purpose. A thermoregulatory muscle repurposed by a reward signal that found an identical sympathetic output channel, the cold signal use. Goosebumps are the only autonomic response you can see in real time with your naked eye. Pupil dilation requires a mirror. Heart rate requires a monitor. Sweat gland activation requires close inspection. The hair-raising contraction is visible from across the room. Your autonomic nervous system has exactly one output that broadcasts to the visible surface of your body, and it can be triggered by 3 completely unrelated internal states. Visibility has a consequence no other autonomic response shares. Goosebumps cannot be faked and cannot be suppressed. You cannot produce them by deciding to produce them. No amount of concentration will make the muscles fire. And you cannot prevent them. When the trigger arrives, no amount of self-control will keep the bumps from appearing on your forearm when the music hits the chord your reward system did not predict. The response is involuntary in both directions. You cannot turn it on, you cannot turn it off. Every other emotional display, smiling, crying, flushing, tensing, can be performed voluntarily or suppressed voluntarily to some degree. Goosebumps are the only emotional display entirely beyond voluntary control. They are the most honest readout of internal state your body produces, honest because you have no mechanism to intervene in the signal between the trigger and the skin. This involuntary authenticity is why goosebumps function as a trust signal in social contexts. If someone describes an experience and bumps appear on their arms, the listener processes the bumps as a credibility marker, an involuntary confirmation that the emotional state is genuine. You cannot fake the signal. The recipient's social processing registers this below conscious evaluation. The bumps carry more persuasive weight than any words because the bumps cannot be manufactured by intention. If you are over 45, you may have noticed that your goosebumps are less frequent or less pronounced than they were at 20. The change is not imagined. The smooth muscles at each follicle atrophy with age, the fibers thin, The contractile force decreases, the visible bump becomes smaller and less defined. The sympathetic nerve still fires. The signal still arrives. The muscle that receives the signal is weaker than it was. A 50-year-old's goosebumps are measurably smaller than a 20-year-old's goosebumps from an identical stimulus, not because the emotional or thermal response is weaker, but because the effector muscle has lost contractile mass. If you notice your goosebumps becoming less visible with age, the experience is consistent with the muscle physiology. The reflex is still firing. The display is dimming. The dimming is muscular, not emotional. Atrophy raises the question, sharper than anything else, if the reflex weakens with age, if the muscles are thinning, if the display is fading, why has evolution not completed the process and removed the reflex entirely? Other lineages answered that question differently. Dolphins and whales lost their body hair entirely and with it, the hair-raising muscles. The smooth muscle fibers that fire goosebumps in you are absent from dolphin skin. The sympathetic innervation of the follicle was removed because in an aquatic mammal, a fur-raising response would increase hydrodynamic drag and serve no insulating function in water. The cost of keeping the reflex exceeded the cost of removing it. Evolution performed the surgery in marine mammals. It chose not to perform it in you. Question of why demands an answer. The thermoregulatory function cannot provide because the thermoregulatory function does not work without fur and has not worked in your lineage for 2 million years. The answer arrives later. For now, notice something on your own body that points toward it. The areas where you experience the most frequent and most intense goosebumps, typically the forearms, the upper arms, the back of the neck, are also the areas where your hair growth is most robust and most responsive to seasonal and hormonal change. The correlation has been noted in dermatological literature without the cold or fear pathways explaining it. Cold does not preferentially target the forearms. Fear does not preferentially activate upper arm follicles. Something about the nerve firing at those specific follicles connects to the hair growth those follicles produce, and the connection runs deeper than the muscle contraction that creates the visible bump. Now the fear pathway. Because the third trigger uses neither the temperature system nor the reward system, and the evolutionary logic of fear goosebumps explains why the reflex is bundled with the fight or flight response in a way that evolution cannot unbundle. When your threat detection system activates when you are startled, frightened, or experience sudden danger, it triggers a global sympathetic response. Pupils dilate to admit more light. Heart rate increases to supply muscles with blood. Blood pressure rises, breathing accelerates, and the hair-raising muscles contract. In a furred animal, the piloerection serves a specific function, making the animal appear larger. A cat arching its back with raised fur is displaying a body that looks 30% bigger than it is. A porcupine erecting its quills, which are modified hairs driven by identical muscles, is presenting a defensive weapon system activated by an identical reflex. In you, the fear-triggered goosebumps serve no threat display function. Your hair is invisible to an attacker. The reflex persists because it is bundled with the entire sympathetic fight or flight package: pupils, heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, and hair raising, all sharing one neural trunk. Evolution cannot surgically remove one output from a bundled system without risking damage to the outputs that remain useful. The goosebumps ride the fight or flight package as a free passenger on a system that cannot be selectively modified. Removing the hair-raising component would require disconnecting it from the sympathetic chain without disrupting the cardiac acceleration, the pupil dilation, and the vascular changes that share that wiring. The cost of the surgery exceeds the cost of keeping the passenger, so the passenger stays. This is the principle that explains most vestigial features in biology. They persist not because they serve a purpose, but because removing them would cost more than keeping them. The appendix persists because removing the lymphatic tissue it contains from the immune system architecture would require rewiring that evolution has not performed. The goosebump persists because removing it from the sympathetic bundle would require disconnecting a nerve that serves other functions the organism needs. 3 pathways. 1 muscle. Cold through the hypothalamus. Fear through the threat detection system. Music through the reward circuitry. all converging on 5 million smooth muscle fibers pulling on hairs too short to do anything the reflex was designed for. And the three-pathway convergence, cold, fear, and dopamine all using one muscle output, each for a different evolutionary purpose that the muscle can no longer serve, is the overlap that permanently changed what a goosebump means to me. Beyond the three triggers, the aesthetic dimension, because the dopamine pathway produces a phenomenon that has been studied separately from goosebumps and that reveals individual variation in how brains process reward. Frisson, the aesthetic chill, the wave of sensation that passes through your scalp and down your spine during music, literature, art, or encounters with natural beauty, has been measured as a distinct psychophysiological response. Between 55 and 86% of the population reports experiencing it, depending on the study and the triggering stimulus. The remaining population does not. Difference correlates with a measurable personality, dimension, openness to experience. Individuals who score higher on openness report more frequent and more intense Frisson episodes. The correlation has been reported across several studies, most consistently by Nussbaum and Sylvia, who found that openness to experience predicted Frisson frequency independent of musical training. If you score high in openness, your brain processes the prediction error from an unexpected chord change with greater dopamine response than if you score lower. More dopamine, stronger sympathetic discharge, more visible goosebumps. The personality trait is readable on the skin, and the reading is involuntary. Musical features that trigger Frisson most reliably have been catalogued. Unexpected harmonic changes a chord the auditory system did not predict. Sudden dynamic increases, a quiet passage exploding into loud. The entry of a new voice or instrument that the auditory processing was not tracking. Melodic appoggiaturas, notes that create brief dissonance before resolving to consonance. Each of these produces a prediction error in the auditory processing system, the signal deviated from what the brain expected. The error triggers the dopamine surge. The surge triggers the sympathetic discharge. The discharge reaches the muscles. The bumps appear. Goosebump during music is the last domino in a prediction error cascade from auditory processing to reward circuitry to sympathetic output to skin surface. The music was the first domino. The bump is the visible evidence that every domino between them fell. Musical frisson is the most studied trigger. But the dopamine pathway produces goosebumps from stimuli that have nothing to do with prediction error, and the non-musical triggers reveal something about the range of experiences your reward system processes as rewarding. All produces goosebumps. Standing at the edge of a canyon, watching a thunderstorm from a distance, seeing the night sky in a location dark enough to reveal the density of the stars, witnessing a birth, hearing a eulogy that captures someone perfectly. The awe response produces the sympathetic discharge through the reward pathway, but the trigger is not a prediction error. The trigger is scale, the perception of something vast, something that exceeds your current model of the world, something that requires your cognitive framework to expand in order to accommodate what you are perceiving. The psychological definition of awe requires two components, as Keltner and Haidt described it: perceived vastness and a need for accommodation. The sense that your existing understanding must restructure to contain what you are experiencing. The restructuring produces the dopamine. The dopamine produces the sympathetic discharge. The bumps appear. All triggered goosebumps feel different from musical goosebumps, slower to arrive, longer in duration, more likely to travel down the spine than across the forearms. The difference reflects the temporal profile of the stimulus. A musical prediction error is momentary, a chord changes, the dopamine pulses, the bumps appear and resolve in seconds. An awe experience is sustained. You stand at the canyon rim for minutes. The vastness does not resolve into familiarity. The dopamine signal is maintained rather than pulsed. The goosebumps persist because the trigger persists. The wave across the skin travels more slowly because the sympathetic activation builds gradually rather than spiking. Nostalgia produces goosebumps through a pathway that combines the reward system with autobiographical memory retrieval. A song from your adolescence, a smell that reconstructs a room you have not entered in 30 years. The voice of someone who died. The memory retrieval activates the reward pathway because the brain processes the retrieved experience as a form of reward. The pleasure of recognition. The emotional weight of the remembered context. The goosebumps during nostalgia are the reward system responding to a memory the way it responds to a present stimulus, and the visible bumps are the skin displaying a dopamine signal triggered by something that no longer exists, except as a neural pattern in your memory and cortical stores. Nostalgia trigger becomes more potent with age, not less. A 20-year-old has 2 decades of autobiographical memory to draw from. A 60-year-old has 6 decades. The library of potential triggers is larger. The emotional weight attached to older memories is often greater. The distance between the present self and the remembered self increases the dopamine response to the retrieved experience. If you find that music from a specific period of your life produces stronger goosebumps than any contemporary music, the explanation is not that old music was better. The explanation is that the neural pattern attached to that music carries decades of accumulated associative weight that contemporary music has not yet earned. The goosebumps are measuring the depth of the association, not the quality of the stimulus. And here is where the question the title promised arrives, because the 3-pathway explanation tells you how goosebumps are triggered but not why. The body kept a reflex that no longer serves any of its 3 original purposes. Insulation fails without fur. Threat display fails without visible hair. Even the dopamine pathway produces bumps that serve no communicative function the reward system requires. Why did evolution maintain 5 million muscles that accomplish nothing? In 2020, a research group at Harvard published a finding in Cell that reframed the entire question. The sympathetic nerve fibers that connect to the hair-raising muscles also form a direct connection to the stem cells at the base of each hair follicle, the regenerative cells that produce new hair growth. When the sympathetic nerve fires during cold, during stress, during emotional response, it simultaneously contracts the muscle and stimulates the stem cells. The nerve serves 2 functions. The muscle contraction is one. The stem cell activation is the other. Goosebump reflex may be maintained not because the goosebump matters, but because the nerve pathway it uses is essential for hair regeneration. Removing the sympathetic innervation of the hair follicle, which would eliminate the goosebump, would also remove the stem cell stimulation that drives the hair growth cycle. The body cannot disconnect the muscle contraction without disconnecting the regenerative signal. The goosebump is a side effect of a stem cell maintenance system, a visible, functionless byproduct of a regenerative process that evolution cannot afford to lose. The reflex persists not because raising fur matters, it does not, in a body without functional fur. The reflex persists because the nerve that raises the fur also feeds the cells that grow the fur. Disconnect the nerve to eliminate the useless contraction, and you eliminate the useful regeneration. The goosebump is collateral output from a system whose primary function is invisible. That finding the stem cell connection discovered in 2020, the realization that 5 million vestigial muscle contractions are the visible byproduct of 5 million regenerative nerve signals. The skin requires is the connection I cannot separate from the goosebump, since the cell paper made it visible. Goosebumps are also socially contagious, and the contagion operates in modern contexts that the evolutionary origin does not predict. Seeing goosebumps on another person's skin can trigger goosebumps in the observer. Hearing someone describe a chill-inducing moment can trigger them. Watching a video of goosebumps forming on someone else's arm can trigger them. The mechanism operates through your brain's movement simulation system. The visual or narrative processing of another person's skin response activates your own sympathetic pathway, producing the hair-raising contraction without any direct cold, fear, or reward stimulus. You have experienced the contagion in social settings without recognizing it as contagion. A concert audience experiencing a collective chill during a performance, a wave of goosebumps passing through a crowd as the music hits the moment. The experience feels shared because it is shared, each person's visible response triggering the response in the people around them, the contagion amplifying the individual reaction into a collective sympathetic activation. The audience is not just experiencing the music. The audience is experiencing each other's experience of the music, the dopamine cascade propagating through visual contagion alongside the auditory trigger. A speaker who produces goosebumps in an audience produces a visible credibility signal, rows of forearms displaying involuntary sympathetic activation in response to the speaker's words. The audience cannot decide to produce the response. The response confirms, involuntarily and publicly, that the words are landing in the reward circuitry. Political speeches, eulogies, wedding toasts, commencement addresses, the moments that produce visible goosebumps in an audience are the moments the audience's reward system collectively processes as genuinely significant. The contagion amplifies the signal. One person's bumps trigger their neighbors. The wave spreads. The shared response produces a sense of collective emotional experience that no voluntary action can replicate because the display is involuntary. It carries the authenticity that voluntary applause or cheering cannot guarantee. Contagion had evolutionary value in social groups. If one group member experienced a cold front or a predator approach that produced piloerection, the visual detection of raised fur by nearby group members triggered a preemptive sympathetic activation, preparing the group for an equivalent environmental change or threat before they directly experienced it. Goosebumps were a visible alarm. The contagion was the alarm spreading. In a furred ancestor, the raised fur was visible at distance. In you, the contagion still operates. You catch goosebumps from seeing them, but the signal is faint because the vellus hair is nearly invisible. The alarm system is still broadcasting. The antenna is too short to receive clearly. One trigger that surprises people, silence, can produce goosebumps. A sudden stop in music, the pause after a held note before the resolution arrives, the moment of quiet before a crowd erupts. The silence is a prediction error. The auditory system expected sound to continue, and the signal stopped. The absence of expected input produces a dopamine response through the prediction error mechanism, and the sympathetic discharge reaches the skin. You can get goosebumps from the removal of stimulus, not just from the arrival of one. The bump on your arm during the silence before the orchestra re-enters is an identical dopamine cascade to the one that operates during a chord change triggered by what was subtracted rather than what was added. The next time goosebumps appear on your arms from cold, from music, from a moment that stops you, look at them. You are watching your autonomic nervous system produce a motor output on the surface of your skin. If cold triggered them, you are watching a thermoregulatory pathway fire through a program designed for fur you do not have. If music triggered them, you are watching a dopamine surge in your reward system cascade through the sympathetic output to 5 million muscles that cannot accomplish what the dopamine is asking them to do. If fear triggered them, you are watching the fight or flight package deliver a threat display that no attacker can see. 5 million muscles, all involuntary, all pulling on hairs too short to serve their original purpose. 3 triggers: cold, fear, dopamine, converging on one reflex through 3 unrelated pathways. The reflex persists because the nerve that fires it also maintains the stem cells that regenerate your hair. The goosebump is the visible surface of a regenerative signal. The bump is the side effect. The stem cell activation is the function. And the chill that runs through you when the music changes the wave of bumps across your forearm, the tingle down your spine, is the most honest readout of your reward system available to your naked eye. No instrument required. The skin reports. The dopamine was there. The bumps are the proof.